Good, that should be recording now. Excellent. So, the history of transport in early modern England has often focused on specific elements within that vast network, such as turnpikes, the postal service, David Harrison's work on bridges, and Dorian Gerhold's research on roads and carriers. However, inns, innkeepers, hostlers and ostlers have often been sadly lacking in this analysis. The interested reader can be directed to a few places outside of the period of this project, but very interesting is a 2015 MA thesis from the University of York by Karen Green entitled Urban Innkeepers, Their Inns and Their Role in the Economic and Cultural Life of Leeds and York, 1720 to 1860. John Mine, a historian of St Albans, has also been working on the early modern inns and innkeepers of that crucial transport town. And from a recent conversation, his upcoming work, when published, will be very interesting to anyone interested in the topic. We must also note Mark Howard's excellent book on the early modern alehouse, a setting with differences but also similarities to the early modern inn. Perhaps the most notable contribution to the subject is Alan Everett's The English Urban Inn, 1560 to 1760. Everett argued that by the 18th century, the size of inns had increased significantly, along with the status and wealth of leading innkeepers. The inn was a space for trading, auctions and sales, and could serve an indoor market for hops, seed, corn, malt and cloth. By his assessment, inns were places for social interaction and entertainment, as well as for assemblies, horse races and feasts. Everett's work demonstrates how inns were involved in all aspects of life within towns, where people from all levels of society could meet. Inns were therefore an important part of the society around them. In her talk early in this series, Catherine Ennis discussed local inhabitants on either side of the 16th century road, who were some of its most prolific users, and took upon themselves its upkeep. There appears to have been a certain community pride in having this major road pass through, and the road served as a local boundary, one which became the subject of a dispute, to our great joy as historians, as it leaves lots of evidence. With the work of Everett and Ennis, we see how transport infrastructure must be viewed within its local and community context as something contributing and drawing from them. Inns and the people who worked in them often offer an inciting study in this vein. And it is within this human infrastructure of innkeeping that the Viae Regiae Probate Team have been working. The remit of the team was which had been proved in the Prerogative Court of Canterbury during the 16th and 17th centuries. This basic proposal gave a total of 69 PCC wills, which had been recorded from 1528 to 1649, and which came from a range of counties spread across the whole of England. We were very much aimed for this to be a starting point, the wills from this court being the wealthiest in the Archbishopric of Canterbury, so mostly the southern and Midland parts of England. Right up to Lancashire, I think, is our northernmost will. There remains wills in the Prerogative Court of York, in lesser courts, and of course probate inventories, which could be of interest. In effect, we had in our sample covered the top level of these trades, covering quite a large part of the country. Our hope was that in these wills, these men would reveal details about the routes, business connections, and things which may illustrate how inns and innkeeping were supporting a developing road network, thus placing these people within the Viae Regiae transport framework. One of the earliest wills that we looked at, that of John Humberstone, which is here, of Ware in Hertfordshire, appeared to do just that. Humberstone was the father-in-law of Thomas Hobsone of Cambridge, and refers in his will to his house passing to Hobson after the death of his wife. Hobson's famous Cambridge to London route travelled via Ware. It may be that the house bequeathed by Humberstone was acquired by Hobson with the purpose of it forming a key component in his transport network. However, with the exception of this one will, the wills were somewhat disappointing in enabling us to link the testators within the wider Viae Regiae framework. Nevertheless, the wills did prove details of other areas of interest. So, for example, the bequests contained in many of these wills gave an insight into the material culture associated with innkeeping. Some wills gave evidence of more household goods than would be required for a normal household, for example, suggesting they may have been used as part of their occupation. We have, for example, one quote here. I'm not going to read out all the quotes, but we do have quite a few along the lines here. Feather beds were quite frequently referred to, suggesting these were goods associated with the occupation of an innkeeper. If you've had a look at that, that's maybe not the most representative. It's quite a long one, but it gives you a sense of some of the things that were bequeathed, and we quite often see these things, beds and their associated items, cropping up again and again. And we also see references to beakers and cups and other things similar. And Stephen Pitway gave his son Edward in present possession of such part and rooms of the house wherein I now dwell, commonly known or called or known by the name of the Red Lion. Stephen Pitway's inn later became the Northwick Arms, which we'll see later on in one of the images we've got here. It still exists on the banks of the River Avon in Bengeworth. It was rebuilt in the 19th century. But we often get, as well as the material culture itself, but the sense of the rooms that the inns contained. Now, a further interesting aspect of wills is that when taken as a whole, they provided details about innkeeping as an occupation during the early modern period, and showed many innkeepers held more than one inn or engaged in multiple occupations. For the most part, wills are silent on whether the testator managed his inn directly, whether he was simply the landlord, whether he managed the establishment on the behalf of an owner. Nevertheless, a few wills do give details which enable the testator to be placed into one of these categories. For example, in his will of 1604, Hugh Evans was clear to ascribe himself the occupation of head ostler rather than innkeeper. This also suggests that at this time there may have been a clear distinction between innkeeper, i.e. a person who owned an inn or inns, and an ostler who was responsible for the day-to-day running of the establishment. This was certainly the case with Christopher Bremer, innkeeper of St Martin's in the Field, who in 1647 bequeathed 40 shillings to his ostler, which shows that he did not manage his inn directly, but through someone else. This is also shown in a few other that the innkeeper held more than one inn, almost certainly leaving the daily organisation of his inns to tenants or ostlers. And John your inn called the Saracen's Head, situated at Islington, and he also referred to his inn called the Nag's Head. Now, many of the wills make very clear that for many innkeepers, their inns were just part of one aspect of their property holdings. Many of the wills confirm that the innkeeper held other property, sometimes quite significant amounts. For the most part, these holdings were of land, such as the lease of certain parcels of my land lying in Old Sodbury, which William Keynes referred to in his will. Now, other innkeepers specifically identified their land holdings as being agricultural, calling them pastures, for example. Sometimes referring to stables, tenements, stables, barns, as well as other types of tenements. John Humberstone, who we've already met, left to his wife Elizabeth the orchard, which he'd bought, and the barns and stables thereunto belonging. Edward Buxton gave to Thomas Sheppey one garden adjoining the Talbot, which was his inn. Other innkeepers held tenements in addition to their inns. Christopher Hicks referred to 2 tenements in Geoffrey Lane on the east side of the water in Boston. It's another site of a former inn there. Hugh Evans, head ostler of All Hallows, Lombard Street, gave his loving wife £10 of lawful English money to be paid out of his lands. John Atkinson, innkeeper of Islington in Middlesex, referred to land in Clerkenwell and Islington, as well as his lands lying at Dunmow in the county of Essex. And many of these property holdings were leased out to tenants as well. Unfortunately, none of the wills confirm that the inns themselves were leased out, but it's evident that some rooms within inns were leased out to people who stayed longer than just the occasional night that might be expected of a traveller. John Atkinson, innkeeper of Islington in Middlesex, gave his wife 4 rooms in the occupation of one ward, a chandler, being part of my In the Nag's Head. As well as land and property, there's also evidence of bequests of livestock. John Atkinson gave his wife Dorothy 14 cows and his son Richard 4 of my best milk kine, which now be with calf, which he have marked forth with their calves. John Sowie gave John, my son, 49 shillings in thereof the old cow that he's carving. Edward Buxton gave his daughter Susanna 1 cow, grass pasturing or feeding, and 1 cow both as well in winter as in summer. So innkeepers seem to be engaged as well as in livestock, land holding, leaseholding, all kinds of holdings like that. They also seem to be engaged in all manner of trades. We have Stephen Pitway of Bengeworth, Worcestershire, seemingly combining his innkeeping of the Red Lion with baking. He bequeathed all necessary implements and utensils belonging to the trade of baking, as the furnace, troughs, bolting tubs. It seems likely this took place within the inn, as these items are referred to as being within the bakehouse and shop, which form part of the inn. John King of Wells in Somerset also referred in his will to a shop that may have combined innkeeping with the occupation of a pewterer, since he left a large amount of pewter and referred to a furnace. Not only were innkeepers themselves engaged in a variety of occupations, but the inns were used for other purposes than simply hostelry. John King, referred to above, was also possibly a brothel keeper, since he referred to his will the lease of his houses in Grope Lane. Grope lanes, often referred to as Gropecunt lanes, were found in many English towns and cities, with the name referring to the prostitution that took place within them. Grope Lane in Wells, referred to by John King, was renamed Grove Lane and subsequently Union Street, the name by which it's known today. The will of John Butcher, alias Powell of Norwich, identified his inn as the White Horse. The inn's no longer in existence, but was located in St Martin's Street, next to the Maid's Head Inn. It claims to be the oldest, which claims to be the oldest inn still in existence in Norwich. In common with many other inns, the White Horse was used by many players as a performance venue, and under the management of John Butcher, it became the most popular performance venue in Norwich, frequently referred to in the civic records of Norwich as Powell's or Powell's House. Its reputation was such that servants to Queen Anne, otherwise known as Anne of Denmark, wife of James I, were licensed to perform there in 1616 and 1617. Finally, the wills show that many innkeepers were also engaged in money lending. Richard Lee, Edward Weatherton, William Dixon and John Hughes, who are 4 of our testators, also ran significant examples rather than just the usual small debts. For example, Edward ap John, alias King, listed quite a number of people, and you can see that here. And that isn't the full list as well. That's just what I could fit on the slide, while it could still be fairly readable. This is courtesy of Justin, although we did all agree to put it in. I think this is to show, I'm not sure what the exact words were, but I think it was to show that innkeepers aren't cosy, was the phrase used. We'll come to a bit of a conclusion now. I think I'll leave this up for you. So although wills do not reveal much about the link between the developing road network, and believe it or not, this did start off as a paper and a project thinking about the road network, although we've not really demonstrated anything to do with the road network as such, not in a large scale way, and the inns which provided facilities for travellers along these routes, they did give us an insight into the material culture of innkeeping, together with details of the business lives of the men who identified themselves as innkeepers. For many of these, innkeeping was just one aspect of a multifaceted business operation, which could include quite a diverse range of other activities. While our results are still anecdotal, the evidence we've seen from probate, Prov 11 wills, the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, has certainly added to the sense that innkeeping as an occupational identity was largely distinct from actually running an inn day to day. Men who described themselves as innkeepers were businessmen who employed often this extensive capital in a range of ways, clearly saw the inn as a defining part of their occupational identity. Quaint village landlords they were not. As we consider further steps, we're drawn back to the work of Everett and Ennis in thinking about the community and local context of inns, their owners and their workers. It appears we need a deeper look at a variety of record around these places and the people in a more detailed prosopographical study. For more on the probate project, including our list of wills, you can go to our wiki here. There's a bit of information about the project generally that you can launch off from that link as well. Thanks very much everyone for listening. Thanks Joe and Justin for collaboratively putting this together. We'll open up the questions now, so please do put them in the chat like I say, or do just sort of open up as and when you like, but thank you for listening.
Thank you, Joe.
Cool, good. There's always the fear that you sort of have cut out halfway through and you've been talking to an empty room.
Yeah.
Anyway, good. So yeah, so that was our kind of whistle-stop tour through various wills, and we've got a lot of material. So if anyone is interested in reading in a bit more detail the kind of things that we've found beyond the sort of few little bits and pieces that I put up there, then do get in touch with us. If you've got any questions, we'd love to hear them. Any thoughts? From a project point of view, we're kind of thinking about where we take things forward from here, how things fit in, but also more specifically on the paper itself. We've got a question from James. Do many lease documents survive from the period? We do get a few. I think it depends, and it's trying to find them. Certainly in London, you get a smattering. I don't know if Joe or Justin has got more experience looking up lease documents. That certainly could be the potential route for further. We've got David in there. Yeah, Joe or Justin, have you got anything to add on that?
From my perspective, working on London, that kind of document gets less common as we come through the 16th century, apart from where you might be looking in an institutional archive, so something like the Bridge House or one of the livery companies, who's kind of kept an institutional archive of that kind of thing. But the civic registration of those kind of leases really sort of dies out in the 15th century. But I imagine for most towns and cities, there will be the kind of institutional archives or sort of gentry archives even that could throw a bit more light on this kind of thing. But I might just add sort of generally, I think what I was really getting from a lot of things that we found was that innkeepers are very much of the kind of mercantile status rather than the artisan kind of middling sort bracket that we tend to associate them with. Now that might largely be a product of the fact we're looking at Prerogative Court of Canterbury wills. I'm not sure how whether you said this explicitly, but we were looking at those because of lockdown and because of them being freely available from the National Archives. But Joe, I know you've looked at some innkeepers' wills from other sources, so I don't know whether you might comment on how far my impression carries.
Yeah, no, actually, I mean, it's a little bit different because the wills that I've tended to look at have been really late medieval rather than early modern. But yeah, there's definitely this notion that they are engaged in an awful lot of different occupations. And really, just to give an example, one of the towns that I've looked at in quite great detail is Newmarket. Newmarket was actually considered to be the stopping point for fish being taken from the coast to London. And it's really evident that a lot of the Newmarket innkeepers, as well as it providing services for travellers going from London to Norwich, you know, they were engaged as dealing with fish as well, to the extent that some of them are actually referred to as innkeepers and fishmongers. So yeah, you know, this really does seem to be reflected elsewhere. I don't think it is just the wills that we chose and the fact that they were PCC wills. I think, yeah, you know, these are guys that are engaged in lots of different occupations, whatever they can.
That reminds me, actually, some earlier stuff I did on fishmongers, London fishmongers. A lot of them mentioned their rippiers, who were there, sometimes used interchangeably with ostlers, or ostlers and rippiers.
Oh, right, okay.
So they were the people who took the pack horses up and down from Hastings and the Cinque Ports to carry fresh fish up to London. And by the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century, they were starting to own the inns or have financial interest, the fishmongers this is, to own the inns that they were then leasing to the rippiers, to the ostlers who were facilitating that trade. So it's definitely a kind of sense of, what do you call it, vertical integration, business terms. I see there's some questions from Stephen first and then Trixie.
Yeah, the what you're saying about mercantile interests of innkeepers chimed with what I've been reading in another of Alan Everett's works, when he's writing about the development of markets, market towns, and he was saying in that perhaps later than sort of 1680, a lot of the market charters were being sort of infringed by innkeepers, permitting trading to go on within their premises. So that it certainly sort of adds up to this idea that innkeepers were actually facilitating merchants, if not merchants themselves. And so I wonder whether you'd looked at any of the individuals that were borrowing money from innkeepers. You said there were quite a lot of debts in some of the probate records. I wonder whether you can actually trace those to sort of trade transactions.
I don't know, Joe, the quote you had in a slide, was that one that mentioned the places where those people came from? We certainly had at least one example where the list of debts were from John Smith of Bexley Heath, etc. And I think that was a Southwark guy, wasn't it?
I think so. Just let me check. We do have a few, and I think it's like a lot of the debts that are left in wills of this period. You know, you get the occasional one that mentions a place, but then you get quite often they sort of assume that that's a known thing, or probably they were referencing, you know, paperwork or whatever that they would have had that would have kept it, perhaps. But a lot of these debts being oral would have maybe been passed around, and people would have known about them. The quote that we had up.
Because the quote you had was remarkably detailed and
so John Alford of the same parish owes me 50 shillings. Mr. Ryder, parson of St Magdalen's, St Magdalen's, 4 shillings. A stranger dwelling at Stonebridge, 6 shillings. So that's quite a good one. You know, Thomas Sheep dwelling in Hayes in Kent oweth me 13 shillings. So that is a particularly good one, I think, and there are a few similar, but not quite. That list is there because it's the best one and the longest, I think, out of all of them.
Yeah. Those sort of sums don't sound like sort of big merchant transactions, do they?
No. And there was a discussion that we had before. I think it was Justin, you were saying about, you know, people maybe are going into town and are leaving money with innkeepers and that kind of thing, and it's perhaps people that are attending markets and things like that.
Yeah, I think that was Alan Everett's argument, wasn't it? That the innkeepers as Stephen was saying, a kind of facilitating trade, but that's extending credit to the people who are coming into town and staying in their inn, or conducting their trade in the inn. But it certainly shows the amount of capital they have available to be able to go about doing that, right? It's surely evidence that they're quite well off to start with.
Yeah. I think Trixie, you've had your hand up for a little while. James, I see you've got a question in there as well, which I think we'll come to in a moment, just because it sort of indicates some of where we want to go with the project as well. But Trixie.
Luckily, it was a virtual hand, not a real one.
Yeah.
I've got one question just out of interest, and then a more serious question. Just wondered about William Dixon's house called the Catherine Wheel, and whether you'd followed that one up and why it was called that. But then my main question is, how many inns have you identified, and what proportion of them are still in existence? So how much continuity is there across the period that you're looking at, but also since, to indicate changes in road transport, for instance?
Yeah, we chased up some of them. I know, Joe, you were trying to track them down. I can't remember off the top of your head if Justin or Joe, you remember. That would have been a good figure to have in the paper in hindsight. But we have chased up a few, and the images you saw on there are all sort of on the site of previous inns. And there are a few more as well. I'm not sure if we're quite into double figures, but I don't know if Justin or Joe, you remember.
I'm not sure we kept a record of that systematically, as opposed to just noting the best examples that we could trace up, rather than what proportion they were or anything. The Wells one was certainly an example of the continuity there. Not the one used in the film in Hot Fuzz, it's the other side of the street from that. But yeah, I think that actually closed down during lockdown, as far as I could tell. But yeah, that was a direct continuity, including of name, I think. It strikes me actually it would be quite interesting to collect hubs' claims of when they were founded or when they're first attested, and sort of look at it from that direction as well. Just an aside. Joe, I don't know if you have.
Yeah, no, we didn't have very many that were actually named within the wills. I think there were in total only about 10, and some of those, it was actually innkeepers who held multiple inns and named them in their wills. So probably we're down to only about 6 wills that actually specified the name of the inn. And I did look at a few of them, not all of them, and actually not the Catherine Wheel. But it was evident, particularly the London ones, that they had continued to exist for centuries, quite literally. And that they had been rebuilt very often in the 19th century, but the name had persisted and the location certainly had persisted. And again, there was another one in London, in Islington. I think it was the White Horse, and it was quite sad that it had actually ceased to exist in quite recent years and had become an amusement arcade. So, you know, you felt a bit sad that there it was, recorded in the 17th century, and actually in just recent years, you know, that its death knell had been dealt. So, but I can't add anything about the Catherine Wheel and why it was called that. And that's not one that I actually looked into.
It's certainly a name for an inn I've seen attested before. I don't know if Laura Wright might have mentioned it in her paper at Harlexton. Richard might remember that one.
I don't remember her mentioning it, no, but she might have looked at it, I don't know.
There's perhaps an aside to Trixie too, to look at Laura Wright's book on the naming of houses and the linguistics of that, which she was essentially plugging at the conference last week, wasn't she? Sunnyside, I think, was that the name of the book? Yeah.
Excellent. I've got a couple of questions by James and a question by Richard I know to ask. Just to cover a couple of your points, James, there about following up. I think, as we've established, we've not followed up every instance that we could do, certainly with executors and overseers. That's something that we've looked into, you know, daughters, marriage patterns, the communities generally. And I think that would be a potential fruitful way of expanding the project, although quite time consuming, and realistically with lockdown we couldn't have done it in a particularly comprehensive way. So there is a good cause there for mapping out connections more broadly, you know, not just of histories of places and the locations, but also of people, and including, you've got a point there about court documents. That would be one of the places. So I think we would look for individuals who we've already got mentioned in other sources, but also people related to them, and sort of building that together piece by piece. So that's sort of partly of the discussion that we've had about things ongoing. Richard, you've got a question, I believe.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. So I've got sort of an observation first and then a question. And the first is relating to that kind of, I suppose, really where they sit on the mercantile artisan line. Because I've got an example from my work where in the 1450s, it's a future Lord Mayor of London buys an inn in Aylesbury. And then it turns up again in the accounts of his executors sort of 20 to 30 years later, where evidently they're kind of, I think, trying to make it profitable. It becomes kind of the livelihood of his widow. She rents it out and collects rents from it. And they end up building a barn, which I think is kind of an attempt to make it make some money. So I just wonder if maybe there's kind of, it might in a way have been, and this probably isn't true for every example, but a top-down precedent where kind of mercantile interest in inns sort of then seeped through, so that then the kind of slightly lower status innkeepers started to adopt mercantile practices, maybe. It's just a thought. I don't really have any direct evidence for it, but there's certainly one example of a future London mayor buying up an inn in the mid-15th century, admittedly. And my second question was really, did you notice in the wills any kind of particular devotional practices that you might ascribe to innkeepers especially? Is there kind of, you know, I mean, I guess if, depending on how many pre-Reformation ones you get, if there's any kind of devotion to saints or after the Reformation, just out of interest, really.
Sorry. Approach the first interesting point on the top-downness. I'd be interested to see if we could look at that perhaps more widely, certainly when we think about ownership, but that's a good point. I think I saw Justin note that down. In terms of reading the wills, the way we approach things is that we didn't read them all together, so we sort of took a section each, so we can only really speak for our own parts, and I wouldn't be able to comment too much, just because we really kind of just focused on the content and material culture and the connections. I'm not sure if that's something we'd be able to share with you, the material, if that would be possible, Justin. I know we've got it all in Transcribus, and whether Justin or Joe remember any other sort of standout instances.
I think that the Hobson example is a really nice example of that kind of consolidation of the ownership of the actual inns, and the kind of viewing inns as a sort of a capital investment rather than a business to run, so to speak. Yeah, and so it's only interesting that it's happening in the 15th century, and it's continuing to happen in the 17th century. And Hobson is obviously the Hobson of Hobson's choice is the example to end all examples of sort of building up your monopoly of a certain service and then buying all the infrastructure that goes around that to really sell up your profits, isn't it? In terms of religious devotions, the number of pre-Reformation wills we looked at, I think you could pretty much count on one hand, couldn't you? Out of now, whether that might be something to do with the search terms we were using of innkeeper and hostler, and whether we should have been using other descriptions for that. So I mentioned ripiers earlier. I've never tried looking for ripiers in Prop 11 on the TNA website. Lucky dip, whether it's indexed properly or not to start with anyway. But I don't recall noticing any with particular devotions. There are certainly some later, some 17th century ones with particularly flowery religious preambles. But I would say almost more striking by absence compared to other 16th century wills, rather than anything that caught my eye. Don't know if you both agree with that.
Yeah, no, I can't remember anything of interest really in terms of religious devotion to saints or anything like that. No, nothing, unfortunately. But I was interested as to who your mid-15th century London mayor actually was.
It was Ralph Verney.
Oh, okay.
So he's sort of notable for defending the city against the Bastard of Fauconberg's attack. And he gets knighted by Edward IV.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, no, it's interesting to think about the preamble aspect. I think from me, my comparison directly to my PhD sample of 17th century Probe 11 wills, which I'm on at the moment, is fairly similar in scope and content from the dozen or so wills that I transcribed directly. So yeah, nothing particularly out of the ordinary there. Have we got any other questions? I've got to apologise for David as well. I'd started screen sharing before I saw you were coming in, David. So I realised you waited a little while before you could come in. So I am sorry.
I better apologise because I clearly forgot about it.
Oh,
and I was in the garden and I suddenly thought, bloody hell, it's no. Sorry. So very many apologies. I really wanted to see the beginning.
You would have got away with that as well. And now I'm wishing I was in the garden. No offence to everyone here, but I could have maybe done both at the same time. That's quite a good idea. That's fine. You can watch it back. See, there you go. The benefits of recording.
Yeah.
Good. Have we got any other?
There were some more questions in the chat from James.
Ah, cool.
How often do innkeepers turn up in court documents? We haven't, as a group, followed this kind of thing up to the court sessions or anything, although that was one of the things we spoke about early on as potentially probably more fruitful way of looking at the kind of things we're interested in actually. But lockdown and the difficulties of getting even now into archives. I would imagine court sessions is going to be the place to find all of the juicy bits on that, but if and when is a different question.
Yeah, I know Colin had raised quarter sessions as one of the things that he wants to cover at some point. So hopefully at some point the project will move on toward that. And then just a comment there as well, James, it's been quite a classic analysis. For example, London Guilds People's Wills to see whether their confessional tendencies identifiable, such as in the prologues. And just
I would say that's a bit of a fool's errand.
Yeah, I would agree from my work as well. Although I'm trying at the moment to think about bequests to parishes and maybe how that perhaps identified a certain local or religious attachment. But yeah, running after prologues can be hard. I've just transcribed a will of a guy who left several Puritan books, and his brother and nieces and nephews went to be on quite prolific Puritan publishers, and I think his family back home and his will was very plain, and there was no indication that he held any particular religious influence. But by all the other accounts, he was quite so. So it is difficult. One of the problems with wills, actually, we probably should have raised that as part of our sort of scholarly points in the paper of wills, as with anything, they're providing a snapshot of life, and they're not always the fullest of documents, as we've found, especially coming into the later 17th century, that they leave less and less. And we dwelt quite a bit on material culture, but of course, wills quite often leave no material evidence of material culture at all. the relationships that they show are the ones that were held at the time of death and that weren't recording in other places, perhaps, that they felt they had to make a bequest for whatever reason. There isn't always a rhyme and reason to who was given an executorship or an overseership or was a witness above anyone else, apart from the fact they were potentially just available. So all these readings into it become quite complex. I think that's probably one of the striking points of the project, is that it's been quite difficult to sort of wade through all this material and pick out things. And certainly, I don't know if Joe and Justin would agree, when we were putting together the paper, I think that was reinforced, wasn't it? That actually we were fairly disappointed about the content that we did have. And as we've said, some of the questions and comments from James, I think we do need to, if we are to develop this, to look a bit more widely, to go beyond the wills.
Yeah, I think Joe and I have both come from sort of a predominantly late medieval background, and I think it's been quite a rude shock to see how much less detail there is in even a late 16th century will, especially a mid 17th century will, compared to a late 15th or very early 16th century will.
Yeah, definitely.
There's a question from another question from James in the chat. Leases passing on automatically is a very good point, I think. So yes, quite often a lease does specify who it passes to after the decease of the person named. Even a lease for a term of life might nominate someone else, a widow or something, that then wouldn't need to be dealt with in the will at all. So yeah, that's completely hidden from us in that respect. And certainly from my work, I've kind of found increasingly clear that owning property freehold on your own, rather than through fees and through kind of partnerships of some system or other, is the exception rather than the rule. So again, those kind of financial instruments, financial arrangements are happening in parallel to wills or separately to wills, rather than having the chance to appear in that kind of form.
I think that does raise as well one of the questions. We've thought here about how innkeepers and inns were doing other things, and there were other things involved within them and by the people who held them, but also then there would have been other people out in the community that may have held shares, would have been involved in, say, partnerships, ownership of land, all these kind of this sort of complex fabric of society, I suppose, which in early modern England and generally anyway, but we've got this complex network of credit that existed and interrelationships, and it's a sort of community level study, which I think we would have to jump next to properly understand a lot of these things, which again, we could feel with excitement or with dread. I don't know, we're not sure.
I think there's mileage in the idea we've kicked around of a prosopography of the inns of the A1. Starting with Hobson.
Yeah, I'll do the Yorkshire bit. I'll take the Yorkshire lot.
Excellent.
No, that's quite a big lot. That's quite
yeah,
a lot.
yeah. No, it beautifully joins up everyone's interests, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Apart from the Welsh lot, we'll leave them alone.
And Dorset.
Yeah.
But the point, I think, is that the networks follow the roads, and therefore if we're doing that, then rather than randomly sampling the wills that happen to be in a certain court or in a certain county, then following those networks along a road seems the best way to approach it. Yeah,
I think there is mileage in it. Good pun. Yes, I think so. And well volunteered, David. I think we'll bring you on to our next planning meeting. In terms of the question there from James about analysing individual communities, I think that would certainly be a lot more local studies kind of looking at. And one of the speakers we were hoping to have with us, but unfortunately isn't here, is John Mine. And he was going to present in the series, but has been ill, sadly. So we may hear from him in future. And I spoke with him on the phone a few weeks ago, and he's been working on St Albans, which of course is a major hub of transport, and he's been looking in the same period as we have, slightly longer either side, but particularly focused on the 16th and 17th centuries and looking at innkeepers and how they sat within the community and that kind of thing. So that is one example, and I'd imagine there are other examples, and of course there's a rich network of local historians out in the country who will have specialised local knowledge that we could tap into, as well as anybody who's maybe doing academic research or has touched upon things in part of their other studies that they might have come across. For example, Richard has just mentioned a will relating to an inn, and there'll be lots of instances like that. But in terms of particular communities, John is due a book out, I think, in the next year or so. So once that comes out, that'll be really of interest to everyone. Good. Are there any other questions? In my sort of dual capacity as host and speaker, this is usually where I sort of get to the point where I say it's time to let the speaker go, but I'm quite happy if we've got any other questions or comments.
Just on the local issue, in Halifax, dare I mention it again, we've done a study of wills from 1688, all the probate documents from 1688 to 1700. And there are, I must admit, I did think earlier on today that I would look at those and just to see what there was. And guess what? Sorry, my brain is a bit sieve-like at the moment. I think it's coming. Good ideas come in and then they disappear. But I mean, we certainly have got one or two innkeepers in there in the Halifax area who've come in wills. I think at least one widow is in a will, but I can look at those if you want and just see. And I know it's not on the A1, but it's in Yorkshire. So
if it's in Yorkshire, it's good enough, I think, is what David's getting at for life.
Well, perhaps we should let you go, Joe.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I like to say, I'm happy if we've got any other questions or comments. It's quite a nice little group here, and it's nice to hear everyone's thoughts, and it's certainly helped with my thought process. I don't know about you, Joe and Justin.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. A comment from James there for Yorkshire, the wills would be Borthwick. Borthwick Archive, yes.
Yeah.
Prerogative Court of York are there, as well as the various local jurisdictions for Yorkshire, I believe, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah. Borthwick's nice to go to, but reading the wills can be a pain if anyone has been. They're quite a lot of them are quite poor condition, the microfilm I found. From my experience, but lovely archive if anyone gets a chance to go. But yeah, that would be another step. And of course, wills proved in the prerogative that would have been proved in the Prerogative Court of York, but also held property south of that line in the Prerogative Court of Canterbury would have gone to Canterbury as the sort of slightly superior court. So that's why we do have, I think, at least one will that would have been in the jurisdiction of the Archbishop of York, but was proved in the south. So
we did briefly consider looking at wills during the interregnum as our sample on the basis of the single central probate court that operated then being a great way to sample, but that sort of conflicted with what we discovered about the amount of detail in the wills dropping off very quickly after 1620. So yeah, that didn't really work.
Yeah, something to consider. But yeah, yeah, not for just yet, but yeah, lots of opportunity in all sorts of courts across the country, and non-probate material, of course. Good, excellent. Right, well, in that case, I think we're going to let you go, or let me go, however this works. I'm going to kick you all out now. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks very much, everyone, for your insightful comments. I did have some closing remarks, which regarding Sarah's talk. I'll make sure I make those, as that is the chairmanly thing to do. And we've got a really exciting 2 weeks, yes, to the 17th of August, with Dr. Sarah Spooner, who is here today. Hello, Sarah. Be introducing the project. They've been looking at the mapping and tracing of the history of paths, tracks, roads in Norfolk in the early modern period, and looking at estate maps to investigate routes. So that is going to be really interesting, and we're really excited to have you along. And if you do want to attend that talk, you've all got my email address, so just drop me a line if you would like the link for it. Good. Okay. And with that, thank you very much.
That was excellent. Really good. Well done.
Thanks, Joe.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, everyone. David, you can get back out in your garden now.
Thank you. I will.
Excellent.
See you all. See you.
Bye.